and to have an expert on those chairs to talk to us. I hope we all learn something tonight. So, William, thank you.
I wasn't expecting that, Grant, will it? Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much all of you for coming along tonight to listen to me talk. And a big thank you to Kath over there. I've known Kath for several years now, and also to all the volunteers and the members of Alford Manor House. Superb place, and they've been so helpful to help me set up this exhibition. And one other person I do need to thank is sat over there behind the camera, colleague of mine, Julian. He's been a great help as well, helping me set up the exhibition, and also he's loaned quite a few of his rather beautiful chairs as well, putting the exhibition. As you just heard, my name's William Sargent. I haven't got the best exhibition of chairs in the world. I had a couple from Japan visit me a couple of years ago, and you would not believe the museums that they have there on vernacular furniture, of British vernacular furniture. They have the two best ones in the world, and they're both in Tokyo. Isn't that bizarre? I hope you've all been upstairs to have a look at the chairs, and if you haven't, I mean, I do encourage you to go and have a look at them and spend some time there and read the literature that's there as well. There's no other place in the UK you can go and see a collection of chairs like that. There's one or two small numbers, but not such a gathering. There is one chair up there which I know there's a similar one in the V&A Museum in London. Wait for that to go past. But that is not on public display, it just appears on their website. But if you go up there now, there's one of those chairs on display. They are exceptionally rare, and they were probably made in Lincolnshire as well. It's an absolutely fascinating subject. One of the biggest drawbacks about it is there's so few people do research into vernacular furniture. There's one or two people scattered around the country do this research, and most of them are members of the Regional Furniture Society, and that's how we communicate with each other. There's a journal produced every year. There's some very clever furniture historians in that society, and there's some membership forms upstairs as well if anybody's interested in joining. And I've mentioned a term there which I think a lot of you might not be familiar with, and that is vernacular furniture. There's one or two people sat at this table over here who actually know exactly what I'm talking about, and I do apologise to them. Everybody else just needs to catch up for a minute. And I need to explain to you what vernacular furniture is, because a vast amount of it was made in Lincolnshire. And a good way of demonstrating what vernacular furniture is to tell you what it is not. You've all heard of Thomas Chippendale. Born and bred in Yorkshire, went down to London, famous cabinet maker, had a big business down there. It was by no means one of the biggest, but he had a good sized business there. He employed 40 or 50 journeymen to make his chairs. The designs came from all parts of Europe. The journeymen came from all over the UK, and the wood came from anywhere in the world, mahogany in particular. That is not vernacular furniture, and there's so much written down about the things that he made. There's invoices, there's a receipt, there's a method of getting them to the big country houses, and in some cases that piece of furniture has been registered in inventories over the centuries, and you can go there today and see those exact pieces of furniture. That is at totally the opposite end of vernacular furniture. Vernacular furniture is furniture made by local makers from materials that is grown around them for the local population, and usually to a regional design, made in vast numbers and virtually nothing written down about them. One of the biggest problems I have got nothing at all written down, not one receipt, not one invoice, no diary, no daybook, nothing to go on. All I have got is the chairs. So that is what I'm concentrating on. and it is an absolutely fascinating subject. And Lincolnshire made an awful lot of them. And what I'm going to do now is put 3 chairs up here for you to have a look at. And just tell me, has anybody ever seen anything quite like that with that distinctive front leg? It could have been made in Alford. Did you know there were chair makers in Alford? In the mid to late 1700s? Well, they were. We might even find out what chair they were making as well, or what pattern of chair. I just want to go through these briefly because they just highlight what could have been made in and around this area 200, 250 years ago. And if we start with this one, I think you'll all recognise that as a typical Lincolnshire Windsor chair. It's got a solid seat, the legs are socketed in from underneath, and all the back is socketed in from the top. And this one,
the arms and the way the pattern back, is that typical Lincolnshire?
this one, the underarm support, because it's bent. Yep, a lot of the early chair makers use that, the length and breadth of the country. Crooked arm support as opposed to a turned arm support. Yeah. And this chair here has got a drop-in seat. So you can take the seat out and you've still got the frame. The seat has no real structural benefit except to support the person who's on it. And finally, the chair at the end here is a turner's chair. And most people would call that a rush-seated ladder-back chair. There's the rush seating, this is the ladders at the back. This one, I know, was made in Lincolnshire. And the reason I know is because it's got the maker's name on it. And you can all have a look, if you haven't done already, at the back here, on the seat is stamped Hubbard. You can see that quite clearly, and underneath it, worn away, is Grantham. So we know exactly where that chair was made. Just because it says Hubbard doesn't mean that Richard Hubbard made that chair. He employed journeymen, so it came out of his workshop. And it's the same with a lot of the chairs that you see. It is the workshop owner's name, and the place underneath it might say Stanford, it might say Bourne or Sleaford. That is the town they were made in. So it's so easy to identify them. This is a cabinet maker's chair, entirely different, beautifully made. Virtually no turned pieces except these 2 underarm supports. Everything else is made out of angles and shaped. It's called a cabinet maker's chair because it was made in a cabinet maker's workshop. And I'm sure Alford would have had at least one cabinet maker. And in the cabinet maker's workshop there would have been journeymen. They would have made every domestic item that any household would want. Chairs, tables, beds, chest of drawers, coffers, linen presses, they would have made them. And they probably would have had one man on one bench making chairs like this. They're entirely different to these 2, where almost every component is turned on a lathe. The extraordinary thing about this chair, actually I bought it in Lincolnshire, to find a name on these, I have never found a name on a cabinet maker's chair. 1 or 2 have been found and people have done research and found out whereabouts they were made, but they are so rare to find a name on a cabinet maker's chair. That doesn't stop me looking. Every time I see one of these, I'll take the seat out, turn it over, just in case the person who made it put the name on it. The extraordinary thing about this chair is it is made out of the most beautiful straight-grained elm. Well, most of these 2 chairs are made out of ash. Yes, both are made entirely out of ash. These are beautiful chairs, lovely joints. This pattern of chair was made by cabinet makers almost entirely up the east coast of the British Isles. Essex, Norfolk, Suffolk, Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, even all the way up into Scotland as well. So the pattern is very similar everywhere you go, and that's typical with chest of drawers as well. The patterns don't vary. Well, the Windsor chairs can be quite distinct. I'm not going to talk about these very much tonight. If you do see these, and they do appear on the market in the auctions, they're not uncommon, and you can recognise the elm. It's quite clear once somebody's actually pointed out to you what elm is like, and they're beautiful things. But I'm going to put that to one side. I've collected quite a few of those because nobody else really wants them. These Windsor chairs, I'm not going to talk about Windsor chairs tonight for two reasons. Alford has got no tradition of making Windsor chairs. Most of the Windsor chairs were made to the south of Lincoln. They were made later on in Louth, but Alford has no tradition of making those. And the second reason I'm not going to talk about them is because in October I'm going to spend all evening talking about Windsor chairs in Louth. I think it's October the 8th. So if you want to come and learn about Windsor chairs, Lincolnshire Windsor chairs, that's the place to be. I'll just put another rush-seated ladder-back chair out as well. Some of them have got the labels on because I brought them down from upstairs. You can see the pattern's quite similar. The fascinating thing about these chairs, they used to be called pin chairs. I came across that expression an awful lot looking in adverts from the 1700s and the early 1800s, and I wasn't exactly sure what a pin chair was. I asked loads of people in the Regional Furniture Society and nobody knew. Everybody knew 200 years ago what a pin chair was, but it just fell out of fashion. And with some superb forensic data research, Julian has written a superb article which appeared in the Regional Furniture Society Journal last year, and he proves without beyond doubt that these chairs used to be called pin chairs. And they used to be, I think, made in Alford at some stage. You can see they're quite similar in that there's not much decoration on these. This front leg is quite distinct. I'm not quite sure whether you'd call that an elegant front leg, but once you've been shown it, it is quite distinct. This is called a cabriole leg, and this front leg has been made on a lathe. I would have called that an off-centered turned leg, and it's meant to copy this cabriole leg, but the proper name for that front leg is...
Well, I always called it a pad foot.
Say again?
A pad foot.
A pad foot.
That's what I used to call them.
Right, there we are. Rob knows far more about the terminology than I do. And so that has a slightly different appeal because it actually is turned completely on the lathe where this is shaped. The thing about these rush-seated chairs, not one has ever been found with a maker's name. So how do we know whereabouts they were made? How can we find out where these chairs were made? And they were made in vast numbers throughout the whole of the country. One thing I will do at this stage is just, when you're collecting chairs and learning about, when you're collecting anything, and when you start off down that route, you always have a look at what other people have written about what you're collecting. And there's a couple of references I just want to share with you here. The first one is by a chap called Christopher Gilbert, and he wrote this book about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, called English Vernacular Furniture. Now, the interesting thing about Christopher Gilbert, he used to be curator at Temple Newsome, just outside Leeds. I don't know if you've ever been there. If you want a good day out, it is a fantastic place to go. He is famous for writing the definitive work on Thomas Chippendale. I think he wrote it in the mid-1970s. And I actually think he wanted a greater challenge in his life, so he started to do research into vernacular furniture. And this is the book he produced. And in here he's got a small section on Lincolnshire, and when it comes to rush-seated chairs, he has got one small paragraph. And I'll just read some of it to you. He says this: rush-seated ladder-back chairs were made principally in Spilsby, Alford and Louth by members of the interrelated families called Ashtons, Spickins and Greens. No stamped examples have been found, but their local origin is confirmed by strong family tradition and distribution patterns. So he was sort of saying that you can find them in the northeast of Lincolnshire. He does go on to say as well that in a will of 1794, a chair turner called Robert Green in his inventory had rushes. And if he was making Windsor chairs, he would have not had rushes. So it points to the fact that that family and the Spickins and the Greens, they were all interrelated, were making rush-seated ladder-back chairs. And the second place that there's a reference to Lincolnshire rush-seated chairs is in this book. This book is entirely on chairs, and it is a superb book. Everybody starts with this book if they're interested in vernacular furniture, and it's written by a chap called Bernard Cotton, and it was Bernard and his wife Jerry in the 1980s did a huge amount of research to compile this book. And in here the second chapter is on Lincolnshire chairs. There's an awful lot about Windsor chairs, and there's about 8 pages at the back which consist of that. Lots and lots of pictures of chairs, and underneath every one I think he writes attributed to Lincolnshire. And he had to write that because nobody's actually found one yet with the maker's name on it. So when you think about it, trying to locate where these chairs were made, there's 3 ways you can do it. The one way is to look whereabouts those chairs appear, which they did, and they reckon they appeared in Lincolnshire. There's another 2 methods you can use as well. The first one is to find a chair with a provenance. And by that I mean you find somebody who's got a chair in the family, they say their grandfather had it, and he said his grandfather had it. And if you can find a chair going back several generations, and if you can find several of them on one place, then you can say that pattern was probably made in that area. The second thing you could look for is hearsay evidence. And if these are 200 years old, it's a long shot trying to find hearsay evidence. It's not impossible. No, it's not impossible. And when I first started doing this research, I was just building on the research that these 2 people did. Christopher Gilbert and obviously Bernard Cotton and his wife Jerry, they were great friends and they used to share a lot of information with each other. And I think actually that reference to the will and the rushes in the will, I think actually Bill and his wife Jerry found that and shared it with Christopher Gilbert. But they were the 2 founding members of the movement, really, to do research into vernacular furniture. And I've tried to carry that on. And I remember when I first read those books and looked at the pictures of Lincolnshire rush-seated chairs, I could not find any thread to it. I couldn't find a series of patterns which I could line up and think these all went together. It is so difficult to sort them out from those pictures. And if I was a betting man, those pictures in Cotton's book are the least read pages in the entire book. I think you just look at them, and because it's difficult to get a thread on them, and there's not much text, it's difficult to understand what was going on. And I remember about 10 years ago thinking to myself, because I live and work in Lincolnshire, and they didn't, and they were looking at the whole of the country as well, I had the time to try and sort out where some of these chairs were made and see if I could find some hearsay evidence and some provenance chairs as well. So I started buying the chairs, and I invariably asked if there was a provenance to go with the chairs. 9 times out of 10 there isn't. They go through dealers' hands and they get passed on, and it all fades and there's nothing there. And to find hearsay evidence wasn't easy, and I didn't really know where to start, and I kept on looking to see if I could find people who were interested in this subject. And I remember one day, 6 or 7 years ago, when I was in the Lincoln archives, I came across a reference to an article in the Lincolnshire Life of a chap who was actually making this pattern of chairs in Spilsby. He set up a workshop there and he was making this pattern of Lincolnshire chairs. And I thought he would be a fascinating person to talk to. And his name was Rob Lee. So I set about trying to find Rob, and it took me a couple of years because he'd moved from Spilsby and he'd long gone. And eventually I set up a meeting with Rob. I went over to meet him, and he gave me hearsay evidence by the bucketful. it was just fascinating talking to it. And I just need to talk you through that because it's such an important part of Lincolnshire's heritage. He said to me as a young man, he was always interested in woodwork. He wanted to have a woodwork shop where he could make furniture. And events in his life led him back from Yorkshire down to London and back to Spilsby. He set up a workshop right at the beginning of the 1980s, making things that people wanted. And it wasn't long before people in Spilsby came to him with this sort of chair and said, "Can you repair it for me?" And then they would have a conversation, and he would find out that these were local chairs. And then somebody else might come in and say, "We've got a set of these chairs, we've had them in our family for years, could you make us one or two more?" Or somebody would come in and say, "We've got these old chairs for my grandparents, they need re-rushing, will you re-rush them, because they are local chairs?" And he gave me a whole raft of names as well, and one or two pictures. And he was making exact copies of the local chairs that were made there. Nobody's ever written that story down. I've met him twice, I've had interviews with him, and I've written a lot down, and I will write all of this down because it's an important part of Lincolnshire's past. I also, at a similar sort of time, got in touch with a chap, and I can't remember how I did it now, but somebody who I think some of you might know, Lawrence Shaw. He has an antique shop in Horncastle, and the interesting thing was his father, Fred, had an antique shop in Spilsby. And in the 50s and 60s, he would have handled no end of these chairs. And obviously, Fred's long gone now. But the fascinating thing that Lawrence said to me, as a young boy, 60 years ago, in their house in Spilsby, they had a set of these chairs, and his father and everybody else knew that they were local Spilsby, Lincolnshire chairs. So there was some wonderful first-hand hearsay evidence which nobody could argue with. So with that, we can safely say, I think, that these are Lincolnshire chairs and probably made in Spilsby. So those are the ways you can track down where these chairs are made. Those are the two people who provided me with so much evidence, but there is a third person as well, who I actually found, quite by accident again, on the internet. This is starting to sound like internet dating, isn't it? Not to worry. Somebody called Mike Ashton had done some research into his family and found out there were quite a few chair makers in his family. And he had posted that on a site called Ancestry. And I think most of us are familiar with that when you're looking into the ancestry of your own family. I managed to get in touch with Mike. And in fact, his wife comes from over this part of the country. And he provided me with some fascinating evidence about his family tree. And what I've got here is a copy of his family tree. And if I can give these out, you can all have a look at them. There's two for you. How many? 3 more tables. Yeah, there's plenty, I think. You might just have to share. I hope you've got your reading glasses with you tonight. Have you got enough? If you look at the family tree, in the first page, on the bottom right hand corner, you'll see there's Michael John Ashton. That's the Mike I contacted on the internet. And his family goes back several generations up to Louth, and eventually at the top, his family goes all the way back to Spalding in 1705. That is when John Ashton of Spalding died. And if you notice, what he's done, I think he's found well over 20 chair makers in his family. They are in bold, so they do stand out. But the fascinating thing about this, he split them up into different towns. Louth was a big centre, obviously. On the left, there's Boston, because the family married into the Spickings. And then in the middle, you've got Spilsby, and off there, you've got two Alford, Ashton chair makers. One of them was born in 1763, and the other one was born in 1786. They were making chairs just a few hundred yards from where we stood. And if the Spilsby one were making this sort of pattern of chair, I've got no doubt that the two in Alford were making a very similar pattern of chair. That has never been published before. Mike's quite happy for me to share it with other people as well. So if you want to take this home and have a look at it, you're very welcome to and digest it. There's a lot of information there. If you turn over onto the second page, I've just highlighted there, that's a picture out of Cotton's book. And if you look at the chair at the bottom left-hand corner, it's remarkably similar to this chair here, except it's got 5 ladders at the back instead of 4. And at the bottom, he said, bottom left-hand corner picture, number NE184. And he's attributed that chair to Spilsby, Alford and Louth. Now this is where it gets a little bit, it diverges a little bit. If you look at the chair on the top right-hand corner, number 183, he's attributed that chair again to Spilsby, Alford and Louth. And I've actually got one of those chairs. I'll put this one down and carry on with this one. This is the most common rush-seated chair I find in Lincolnshire. I've got quite a few of them, and they do turn up quite regularly. You can see, I think, that they were made a little bit later than this one. It's just general appearance. It's a bit more modern. It occurred to me about 4 years ago that I tended to find these in South Lincolnshire. There's this thing again about distribution. I had never ever found one of these north of Lincoln. So it made me start to think that perhaps these were made south of Lincoln, maybe by the Spickings family down in Boston. I was fortunate enough to buy a set of 4 of these with a carver in Bourne, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago now, and they weren't much money at all. These chairs are remarkably cheap to buy. And about 1.5 years after I bought those chairs from Golding's in Bourne, I said to the auctioneer one day, if I give you a letter, could you pass it on to the vendor and see if there's any provenance to go with the chairs that I bought? And so I wrote the letter, gave it to them. Golding's are always helpful. They passed it on to the vendor and I heard nothing. The days went by and the weeks went by and in fact months went by until one day I got the most superb handwritten letter. It was from an elderly lady down near Peterborough. Her husband had died several years before. She'd had to downsize and get rid of a lot of the furniture, and what I had bought was the furniture that came from her husband's family. Her husband's family lived in Thistleton, which is just north of Stamford. And she could trace those chairs back to the end of the Victorian period. How fantastic is that? I never got to speak to her. I tried to track her down, and I think now probably I think she's probably gone, and those memories have gone as well. But getting that provenance from her was just fantastic, and that really almost proved it to me that these chairs were made in Boston by the Spickings family. I just wanted one more piece of evidence. It's all about circumstantial evidence when you're looking where these chairs are made, and I really wanted one more piece of evidence just to wrap these chairs up. And about 4 years ago I got some pictures from a lady in Spilsby She'd taken them in her friend's house, a rush-seated ladder-back chairs. And one of the pictures was of a chair like this. And to me, that really was disheartening, because I did not want to find one of these chairs just outside Spilsby. It was in entirely the wrong place. So I had to go and see her. Made an arrangement to go and see this lady. She had some lovely furniture. And in fact, this is the chair that was in her house. And it's going back to her house when the exhibition was finished. And I had a long chat with her, and I said, why have you got, and I didn't say, why have you got this furniture? I said, is there any provenance to go with this furniture, and particularly this chair? And what she said absolutely amazed me. She said her family used to have property just outside of Boston. They sold up in the late Victorian period, and they moved up just outside Spilsby and brought all of their furniture with them. That is just what I wanted to hear. There's a provenance of this chair going back over 100 years, and it goes back to Boston. So I've got no doubt that this chair was made in Boston by the Spickins family. And you can see what I'm starting to do now. And Cotton couldn't have done this because he didn't spend long enough time here. And obviously Christopher Gilbert, he died 20 years ago, so he couldn't have done this work. Bit by bit, I'm trying to get in order which pattern of chair was made in which place. And one of the purposes of this talk is for you to look in your friends' houses. There might be somewhere some chairs which were made in Alford, and they still live around here. It's not impossible. We've almost got to the end of the period now when that still is viable. But I would love you all to look. And if you ever come across any rush-seated chairs, I don't think there'll be that pattern. I think there'll be this pattern. It's not impossible that we could actually track down the exact pattern of chair that was made by the Ashtons in Alford 250 years ago. But we're getting a long way back, and the trail's getting really cold. Just to go back to this chair as well, this chair is absolutely exceptional in the fact that it has never been re-rushed. I've got two of them. There's one upstairs in the exhibition. That is the original rushing. It is beautiful, fine rushing. And I don't think the rushing came from the Fens. This sort of rushing, I think, comes from Holland. It got imported in huge quantities in the 1700s because it was finer. I actually got this chair from a friend. He was driving through Horncastle. He saw the chairs in the window, went back and bought them for me. When he bought them, the dealer said he got them out of a house in Spilsby. How wonderful is that? Which I was so pleased that he'd got these chairs for me. So I then got in touch with the dealer and said, I'm interested, I've got these two chairs now. I'd be ever so grateful if you would tell me which house and which family these came out of in Spilsby. Guess what they said? Nothing. They wouldn't tell me. I know. And I said, this is purely for academic reasons. It's to do with the heritage of Lincolnshire. And they wouldn't budge. They would not tell me. Do you know, I actually think I know which house they came out of now. But they wouldn't tell me. And vernacular furniture can be like that. You could be so close. You can be so close to getting that vital piece of information, and for whatever reason, it just slips away. But anyway, the chairs that we've been looking at, these probably were made about 1800, maybe afterwards, 1820, that sort of date. But if you go back to your genealogy and your family tree again, you'll see that there's an awful lot of the chair makers were making chairs in the 1700s. And to find chairs made in the 1700s, the mid-1700s, would just be incredibly rare because they don't survive. These chairs are not great survivors. If I was a guessing man, I would say well over 99% of all these chairs have been destroyed because they're so unfashionable. Even if a dealer bought one for 20 quid, it would cost him £80 to have it re-rushed. Then it'd be worth £40. so they don't bother. And that's why they get given away at auctions now. I think a lot of them these days never get to the auction. I think a lot of them just get destroyed because they are so unfashionable. But these are the symbols of Lincolnshire furniture, and they are to be cherished if you ever come across any. But looking at these chairs made in the mid-1700s, I was aware of 2 chairs in a book, and that's on the 3rd page here. I put my glasses on. Well spotted, I could be looking a long time for those. Thank you. Just read what it says about these 2 chairs. They are both dated. On the top of one of them it says 1742, on the top of the other one it says 1739, over 250 years ago. This comes out of a book which Julian's got over there by David Nell, English Country Furniture, page 291, and it says here, both from the north, possibly Lincolnshire. I wonder who wrote that. I don't know David Nell, I don't even know on the go. But I tell you one thing I did do last night, and I often speak to Bill Cotton. I got on the phone to Bill and had a chat with him and asked him about these 2 chairs. Bill said to me that he helped to write an awful lot of the descriptions in the book, and Bill wrote that. But he couldn't guarantee that they were Lincolnshire chairs because he didn't know the distribution, he didn't know the provenance. Wouldn't it be fascinating if we could find another one of those chairs, dated as well? What's the chances of finding one of those, 250 years old? Well, a couple of years ago, I was in a lovely young lady's house, one village outside of Spilsby. She had several rush-seated Lincolnshire chairs, and she took me into her kitchen. And you could have knocked me down with a feather. This is what I found. Just look at this. It is in well-worn state. I want you to have a look at those pictures, those 2 chairs, and have a look at this. Just check that out. And it's dated. 1755, WH at the top, and there's a star in the middle, and there's a star in the middle of these 2 chairs as well. I know the components are not identical, but just look at these underarm supports here going down to that leg. They are identical. So what are the chances, do you think, of those 2 chairs and this chair being made in the same workshop? Do you know, it's got to be close to 100%. And the lovely young lady, in fact, is sat here tonight. Thank you, kid. And I called in when I went past. She let me borrow this for a while so I could photograph it. And then she's had it back, obviously, and then I just collected it on my way past today. But that is not all. Kit told me a story about this chair. It has been in her house for the last 65 years. And it was bought by her brother. Her brother is Lawrence Shaw's father. He was the antique dealer in Spilsby. And he bought it out of a local house clearance sale in a village hall. So there is a huge provenance to go with this chair. This is a sort of chair that might have been made in the mid-1700s, well, we've got them dated, 1739, 1742 and 1755. What are the chances of ever finding another one of these? These are just so rare. And would you like to go back any further? No, it's not possible. Not possible. Surely it's not possible. one of the great things about being in the Regional Furniture Society, different members do buy things that they know other people would want. And I've been very fortunate indeed, this year, by getting my hands on a couple of these. Look at that. I hope you all can see that. I'll just tell you how I've got a pair of those, in fact. It was one of the members of the Regional Furniture Society who set the society up many years ago. He bought a couple of these chairs from dealers down in the Cotswolds. There's a good provenance for you, isn't there? Got bought down in the Cotswolds. What were they doing down in the Cotswolds? And if you have a look again, look at these underarm supports. And there you've got the cabriole leg, which is so distinctive of Lincolnshire. When he wrote to me and he sent me pictures of these two chairs, he said I could have them for my collection. I have to tell you, I was quite sceptical about whether they were Lincolnshire. I could see where he was coming from, but I was a little, you know, I feel so guilty about it now. I was a little bit sceptical that they might not have been Lincolnshire. And I showed a picture of one of these to Lawrence Shaw a couple of months ago, and just to see if Lawrence had ever seen a chair like that. And Lawrence said he hadn't, not that he could recall, but he's had so many things through his hands over the years. And I said, what I can't understand is how come these things find their way down to the Cotswolds. And I'd bought other Lincolnshire chairs in the Cotswolds before. And Lawrence had a perfectly good explanation for it. He said to me that he himself, in the 1970s and 1980s, he could get a lot of country furniture in Lincolnshire, but he couldn't sell it. The clients in Lincolnshire just did not want to buy it. But the dealers from the Cotswolds, because it was a different clientele, probably with deeper pockets, they were quite happy to come up here, buy the country furniture, take it down to the Cotswolds and sell it there. That was a perfectly good explanation. I would have never have guessed at. And if you look at these two chairs as well, just look at these cutouts underneath here for a start. They're remarkably similar. You've got the underarm supports as well, and these have got the cabriole legs. I'm not saying that they came out of the same workshop, but my goodness me, they are close. There's a lot of similarities with them, particularly having that leg as well. There's no way I can say whether this was made before or after that one. That cabriole leg in the front is generally considered to be sort of the Queen Anne period. And it was revived about the year 1700 in France, and it very quickly came over the continent. In the early 1700s, that cabriole leg became quite fashionable, and it was fashionable for a long time afterwards. Country furniture is often slower to catch on to the city design, so that one may have been made 1770, 1780. There's a possibility it could have been made before, maybe 1720, 1730. I don't know. There's no ever way of knowing that. And so we're just about getting to the end of our history lesson. We cannot really get much further back because there's not much recording, let alone finding a chair which is over 250 or 300 years old. But there's one thing I need to tell you. This just demonstrates what exciting and fulfilled lives researchers into vernacular furniture live. A very good friend of mine has a habit of reading obscure books, and he was reading through a book which had the taxes placed on the imports into Boston during the 1600s. It's far better reading than the Farmer's Weekly or watching television, I can tell you. And if you turn to the back page, this is just amazing. And actually the person sat over there with the camera, he's smirking because he found this. And well done, Julian, for tracking this down. Look at this back page here, and this is 1615. for over 400 years ago, and this is the Boston Port Record Book, on the 27th of July, the ship called the Fortune from Amsterdam, which could carry up to 40 tons in weight, and its master was Anthony Israel, who was an alien, which means he was a foreigner. He was from Amsterdam, and the merchant was George Riggs and the master himself. It was carrying rye, clapboard, fir, deal, and also 3 dozen green chairs. There are hundreds of chairs brought into Boston during the 1600s, and there was a tax paid on them. But not only that, we know how much they were worth, because the tax paid was 1 shilling, and tax was paid at 1/20th of the price of the cargo. So the price of the cargo, the value of the cargo would have been £1. £1 was the value of 3 dozen green chairs, 36 chairs, and I think it works out about 6.5 pence each. They were not expensive chairs. They were not the big carved thrones that you would have expected in the 1600s. They were coming up across here by the hundreds from the Low Countries. And it's one thing I've just been looking at relatively recently, and I didn't ever really appreciate what a huge industry rush-seated ladder-back chairs was, and probably still is, in the Low Countries. That's Belgium, Holland, north-west Germany, and north-eastern France. Just because it came from Amsterdam doesn't mean the ship came from Amsterdam. The cargo itself could have come from any of those countries. But they were bringing them into Boston. If they were bringing it into Boston, they'd be bringing them into Spalding, Hull, Lowestoft, other places as well. Chairs were coming across in large numbers. Now you just imagine if you were one of the Ashton family in the 1600s, and this one at the very top on the first page who died in 1705, you just imagine him at the dock in Boston or Spalding, and seeing these chairs being delivered from over the water. There was carriage paid, there was tax to be paid as well. It must have occurred to one of them that there was a good market there, and they could copy those and they could make them cheaper. That is just pure speculation on my behalf, but you can see exactly where the pattern might have come from. The purist would say that that's not actually vernacular furniture because the design has come from overseas. And I've got no doubt that the Lincolnshire pattern did come from overseas, but they're all very remarkably similar. There's an awful lot of history just gone into tonight, and a lot of things that I've spoken to you about, I've never actually put it together before in such a coordinated fashion, and I will write it down at some stage as well. And the one thing I would really like to come out of tonight is for everybody here, when they're out at the friends' houses, wherever they are, just to have a look and see if it is possible to find any of these old chairs. This one from just outside of Spilsby is an absolute cracker, and to have a provenance to go with it as well is just wonderful. There are other chairs out there waiting to be found, and it's an essential part of Lincolnshire's heritage and Lincolnshire's history. And I think I've said enough, Grant.